recommendation around liaison and time is, I'm sure you've got lots of very legitimate practical questions on making those changes and using contracts and hours and whatnot. And I guess just one thing to say that the next session, this area is the one where often we find talking to other schools, talking to each other, running through stuff that we don't, your other schools are much better to talk about, is an area that, you know, on this idea of finding time and making use of space of that. So the two heads that are going to come along next time, well, actually one for each day, isn't it? You know, we can open up some of those questions. Actually, the other thing to say is that we haven't obviously had a lot of time for any time real for any interaction here, backwards and forwards. So we're going to hopefully build that in for next time. If you've got questions on this issue or any other issue, feed them through to James and Vanessa. We'll pull some of those together so we can rethink some of those for the start of next session. And obviously then it's what happens after these two training sessions in terms of those kind of questions and feedback between you. But if you've got anything for Rob and I specifically, then probably the best thing to do is feed them through to James. That was a bit of a sideways step. Okay, so we're going to run through the area that I guess the EF has been focusing on a lot of its effort and money and energy, and it's the kind of other side of the coin to the TAs in the classroom, which is how TAs are delivering structured interventions. And by that, because I know interventions mean a lot of things, we're referring to typically one-to-one, small group, targeted support. We've looked a lot in literacy and numeracy, although of course there are other areas, for pupils that are struggling and need help in catching up. That's kind of what we're referring to. So to give you an example, we funded a project called Switch on Reading, which was developed by two women at Nottingham Council. They were accredited reading recovery trainers. They've been doing reading recovery for a long time, and they created a reading recovery inspired. I got told off for one said it was based, but it was inspired by reading recovery. It was based, and they took reading recovery and converted that into the elements of it in terms of an intervention led by teaching assistants for pupils that were struggling to read in Key Stage 2. We actually did a trial of this at the start of secondary school for pupils that had not made level 4 at Key Stage 2 as a catch-up intervention. I know any secondary people can say, obviously, if you're struggling to read at the start of secondary, you can't access secondary curriculum. You know, it's a real pivot point for trajectories in heading into secondary. So we've done a lot of work actually at this primary secondary transition around reading, and this was one of the projects. But it's essentially a primary intervention that you can run in Year 7 if you want. And yeah, it's delivered by teaching assistants for 20 minutes per day, so brief sessions, which you'll see as a theme throughout all of this. Sustained daily for 10 weeks. And we did, for us, quite a small randomised control trial involving 300 pupils. Basically, we took them, randomly selected half of them to do the intervention, half of them to carry on working with however they were working before, whatever they were doing, whatever with the TA or otherwise. And we looked for the difference in outcomes on some literacy outcome measures. And that difference is not saying that the control kids were not learning, of course they were. But you're looking for the additional impact of doing something different. And that's why we do these randomised trials. It's the only way you can distinguish, you can pull out the additional impact of that additional thing. Well, it's not the only way, but it's the best way. We do, Durham University did this. We always do mixed methods evaluations, so we looked at what the people thought about it, what the kids thought about it, what did the TAs think about it, how has it been adapted, has it been, you know, all the rich stuff about what was going on alongside the data. And got to the chase. The pupils that received this intervention, 10-week intervention, made 3 additional months' progress over and above the progress that was being made by the pupils in the control schools, which was a good thing. What was a great thing was that it seemed to be disproportionately beneficial for low attaining FSM and SEN pupils. So this is it. Everyone gets better, but FSM low attainers get better faster. So you're not gap narrowing by holding the performance of anyone. You know, you're just accelerating more the performance of low attaining and FSM kids. This is a small trial for us, and now there's a huge. Now this was an initial project. There's now a massive trial going on with I think 200 schools, something like that. Thousands and thousands of pupils. Switch on reading. this is the conclusions of the report, which you can find on the website. Again, the next session, we can come back to this in a lot more detail, but the last one is very relevant here, which there was a tendency, or the evaluators noticed that there's a tendency for some TAs to kind of, ad-lib and go off and move away from the kind of plans, and they saw that this was associated with the intervention being less effective. And this is this tension, a healthy tension, between faithful adoption and intelligent adaptation, if you like. And of course you've got to work out how this relates, but at the same time it also matters to keep to the original core elements of the programme. And the starting point should be stick to the plan, and then maybe start thinking about the adaptations, if that makes sense. But and this, I think this is very relevant for TAs particularly, who perhaps don't have the training to underpin some of those adaptations. So that was Switch On. We did a trial of 2 interventions called Catch-up Numeracy and Catch-up Literacy, which you might have heard of. They're more commercial, available. Again, one-to-one support, obviously numeracy and literacy. A lot of the catch-up interventions have quite, I've never done one actually, so I've never seen it, but I've heard that they use a lot of upfront assessment to diagnose very specifically what's the acute needs of gaps for that pupil. So they then target and differentiate the intervention in line with those, whatever the specific weaknesses of that pupil are. And if you look at these sessions, these are 15-minute sessions. So they're so brief that they were being tucked in, at the end of lessons. They were being going on perhaps, around registration. Schools were finding times to do them that really weren't taking the pupils out of the teaching in the lesson. It's the same principle. This is what Rob said. The mantra is around supplementing teaching, and this is an example of that. So the interventions are brief, typically. It went on for a very long time, perhaps too long. And again, so you see the results here. Pupils making additional progress, not quite as much as the other one, but nevertheless still above and beyond what pupils were doing in control schools. To cut a very long and pretty expensive story short, which is probably about £4 million of research there, that we've funded and published now 6 projects involving teaching assistants to deliver high-quality, structured interventions of this type. That's catch-up numeracy, catch-up literacy. The 2 in the middle there, Nuffield Early Language, is an intervention to develop oral language skills in pupils in early years, foundation stage, developed by Maggie Snowlin and Charles Hume, absolute world leaders in literacy development. And obviously you can't learn to read or write until you can speak properly. It's a precondition for it. And if pupils can't come into, and it's about developing early oral language pupil skills in pupils. Reach has oral language in it, but also has things like phonics in it as well, which is for older pupils. And both those interventions had, again, actually quite large effects for digital's progress. Switch On we've covered. Talk for Literacy was a school-developed project. A school in Middlesex developed their own intervention. And again, that showed a positive effect. So if you look down that effect size column, compare it back to the slide with the cancer at the start, which showed this distribution of effects. I've been talking about research like this for 10 years. I've never seen anything like this. It's really unusual to get such consistent findings landing on the head of a pin. It's really unusual. Just to give you a bit of context, around about 20 or 30% of EF trials show positive effects. 100% of these projects are showing positive effects and the same effects. It's really, really unusual. And I think we're going to see more. We've got more projects coming through that are showing similar kind of signs of promise. It's really unusual. This is quite a clear picture, an evidence kind of picture. So some of the other areas require, complex kind of rapid. This is actually quite straightforward. Do some of this. So going back to the recommendation, it's a really positive. This is what's so nice about this TA kind of story that's emerging, is that there's a really clear evidence-based picture of TAs adding positively to pupil attainment when they're being deployed using these interventions. But the second and third point, you just can't overemphasize enough. What the DIS project found was when they looked at their
research was not no intervention going on. In fact, the opposite. They found lots and lots of intervention going on, but it was informal, unstructured, typically sessions where kids were taken out for hours, out at the time. And that, when we met, we had a different perspective. They were saying, well, that's contributing to the problem. That's part of the findings, that's contributing to the... So what's clearly coming here is we did another session where we got about 20 schools to write down all the interventions they were doing. And if the same intervention was there, we got them to put a tick. And there were over 100 things written down on that piece of paper by the time they finished. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not as though we're not doing interventions with TAs or otherwise. And the lesson, so the findings were comparing to that. The control condition, business as usual, was lots of interventions going on. So basically what it's saying, it's not whether or not you do interventions, but absolutely about how you do those interventions and the discipline, the precision that goes on in them, the structure that goes on in them. And only you know what's working for you, but this is if this is very recent research. This is ongoing. So this is pretty typical, I think, of what's going on. So it's absolutely about doing interventions, but absolutely about doing them right. The characteristics that seem to emerge across these projects are brief sessions, typically less than half an hour, regular and sustained. Brief, regular and sustained. Because of that, they need careful timetabling and structuring. So you'll notice you need a rhythm of delivery. There needs to be a rhythm and a sustained nature to having this delivery, and not sort of dropping a session because it's not fitting in. So there's something about really guarding the time for doing these things. Lots of training and lots of coaching. So this is this distinction, I think I've mentioned it already, which is sessions like this, training sessions, you learn the concepts and you learn the kind of theory, if you like, but just like learning to drive, it's only when you try it out and get someone feeding back and modelling and refining that you take that stuff from up here and actually get it into practice. And we're suspect of this, we do a lot of upfront training, but I don't think anywhere near as much follow-on coaching. So I think so always bear that in mind when you're doing training. There might be lots of kind of conceptual understandings, but actually the transfer into practice only comes when you've got that modelling and feedback and refinement. So that's a characteristic of these projects. They all have quite heavily structured resources, even lesson plans. I mean, if you've got 15 minutes of switch on, but if you get in there working out what you're going to do, start at 5 minutes, it's finished. And so these, even down to minute by minute, I think catch up is very, very, very structured, given the brief amount of time you've got, and they have really assessment woven through all of it. So assessments to find the right pupils, making sure the right pupils have got the right interventions, assessment to work out what their particular weaknesses are, assessment to monitor their progress, and assessment, hopefully, to find that they've made progress and they no longer need interventions again. So assessment is wrapped up throughout the whole process, only for the purpose of learning, not for any summative basis. It's all formative. Okay, so that's the stuff around interventions, and as I say, this is quite reasonably straightforward. Of course, we're not suggesting that these are the only effective interventions. These just happen to be the ones that we've evaluated, and all of them are showing effects in this way. We're evaluating things like every child counts, first class at number. There's one called ABRA that's going to come out. Keep an eye out for that. That's looking promising as well. So but there actually is, they're actually becoming more of a meaningful choice now. It's not just choose from these 1, 2 things. Actually, kind of going to be half a dozen evidence-based TA-led interventions to choose from. And one thing we've been saying was, if there's an appetite for this stuff, we can lean on these people to come to Suffolk. Suffolk, crikey. Damn it.
That's a tenner you owe me.
Yeah. So we can. The reason I mentioned Suffolk actually was that we organised an evidence fair in Suffolk, where we got some developers to come along with schools, people that had actually been through the intervention, and schools we did them at 20-minute sessions, and we rotated round, and schools could come and talk and find out about it, ask questions, etc. And if you want, we can get these people here to do that. Perhaps later, I would suggest think about the deployment, think about all that first, and then I think you can think about this later. The final recommendation, as I mentioned, which is, I think we're suspect of this sometimes, that you do all this great work in intervention, you evaluate it, you show an impact on an outcome, and then unless you really help make the links between that and what you're doing at the SATs or whatever it is at the end of the year, then perhaps some of that learning and that isn't transferred obviously back into what they're doing back in the classroom. So, and this comes right back to the liaison and recommendation 4 about linking. And obviously the way you need to do that is create time for teachers and TAs to be talking about what's going on in the intervention so that they can help the pupils make the links back. So again, it's just another reason why you need that some kind of liaison at some point, even if it's only half term, to make those links. So where I think this kind of leaves you on interventions are, and again, perhaps from the heads next time we'll talk about this, is perhaps just taking a step back, looking at the interventions you've got going on, perhaps focusing on the other aspects of the TASU first, and the teacher training and the interaction first, and then very carefully selecting 1, 2, 3, whatever you work it out, of few well-chosen interventions that supplement exactly what you're trying to achieve with the teaching, and judiciously chosen to embed that, and then do a few things well rather than lots of things kind of, with lots of less tracking. And I think that's the lesson that the schools that have moved in this direction have gone for. And they should be at least compensating, of course, for the time spent out of class, but they can and they will, they clearly are, when we do this work. Yeah, so that's interventions. What we'll do next time is so we've got, again, more resources on this. We've got things like this, which is a interventions health check, set of questions. You can go back and think about each intervention and look at, ask some questions about interventions in relation to some of this stuff. But we won't try and do all of that now. And let's not do that either. That was the other RAG exercise as well. But if you're going to go back to schools, think about this. Be honest. Look at how your performance really relates in relation to this. Just one thing, just on the still, just a second. On the RAG exercise, what I found with schools is that, I don't know what you've written today, but often it's inconsistent. Quite often it appears on it. And that's and you'll be thinking, yeah, I know that's going on great in that class, but not in that class. Push yourselves to put numbers, put percentages on where each, be analytical about it. Because A for 2 reasons. One, it means that in 6 months, 9 months' time, you can actually track changes in quite a kind of precise way. But the other thing is that in doing so, you'll identify all the answers within your school. Because if you say, yeah, I know where great practice is going on, well, there you go, you've got it there, it's in your school. And you really start thinking about and then you can use that practice, of course, to then model and bring on some people that perhaps are a bit more reluctant. So the RAG exercise, I think, if you do it in that detail, I think gives you that, helps you really unpick where the good and bad practice is. Okay, so that was whipping through interventions, and Rob's going to finish off half an hour thinking about this process of change.